All right, look, I've hit the record button, so what we'll do is I'll throw the floor open. Any more questions before we get started? I mean, some very good questions there. And we'll come back to those because I'm sure that some of the people who've just joined or are joining later, or even on the recorded component which we've just started, will want to know the answer to some of those. But I do a session towards the end, which I will actually focus on what comes up in the forum and also on the assessment tasks. So let's get cracking. So we're looking this week at scientific investigations and the scientific model. Now, invariably, you're into the course and hopefully things are happening. You've got your weekly downloads happening. You're working your way through Loxley. You're working your way through Gregson. You're getting a little bit familiar in the language and a little bit comfortable with all of that. And what we'll try and do now is sharpen it a little bit and point it towards the assessment so that we can start to really hone in on that task in week 5. A couple of things coming from the forums this week. Eloise raised a really good question about what constitutes a group. And I'll just put on my highlighter here and so that we can actually look at some of these things. And again, I refer to perhaps a notion of 3 students. 3 learners are enough for you to do a round circle diagnosis when you're looking at a concept. And bear in mind, those kids are probably going to be representative of their age group. But you don't have to even, if you're stuck with a cross-age group, that's fine too. Okay, you may look at linguistic differences or language differences in understandings across that group, and then you may, in part B of your assignment, target a learning sequence for a particular member of that group, a particular age-related member. So you're all going to be facing different audiences, and my message to you is try and adapt your diagnostic test and your lesson sequence to your audience. That's really where the marks lie here. It's not being able to produce a copybook diagnostic test and a copybook lesson. It's actually being able to go through the process of working out what needs to be done. So if you've got three people, 3 kids that you can use as a group, and the group don't even have to be a real-time group, they can be a virtual group. So you'll need to design a diagnostic tool that can go to individuals at different times. And then you as the teacher can collate the analysis, and you can still do really, really good planning to address that conception or misconception in practice. Nicole made a really interesting point. The Scoodle links, they do this every year around about this time in July. They renew the links. It was a good pick up on her part. I've actually set those links back to their original direction. The Scoodle resource is great. Obviously, it's developed by the Queensland College of Teachers, and it's called How to Teach Science. Now, it's really designed for people with little classroom experience and background. So it's very much, do this, do that, do this. But bear in mind, it's a really good reminder, and it's a free resource available to you. So don't forget it, because the section on science investigations is really quite a good little section. Caitlin picked up the set and recommended readings, wanted to know where they were. All of the readings are tucked under the assessment task number 1 link. Okay, and they are all there and available to you. So they're sitting underneath that link. Throughout some of the learning materials, I refer back to them as well, so that we can actually build on our understanding and incorporate them as we go. Nicole again came out and said on assessment task number 1, some of the documents are being hidden. Again, I've had TASAC look at this for me. This particular site, I've had to reset it 3 times already. So there's some sort of ghosting problem. When it was obviously originally built, there were some problems in the design. So it keeps linking back to past versions of itself. So we'll keep fixing them. We're assured that it should be right from this point forward. And Kate had a really good question based on last week's Zoom session. How do we approach the written response? And let's talk a little bit about this week as we go through. 2,500 words in total. So again, do not exceed the limit, plus or minus 10%. That doesn't mean that you have to starve yourself of opportunity, because you have a thing called an appendices. And if you want, you can put your diagnostic data, the survey, all in the appendix. And it doesn't count towards your word count. So an appendices, let's get clear on our definition of what an appendix is. It's not a box where you throw everything, but an appendix is a place in your paper where you can refer from your discussion to your appendix, but the decision to go there, it remains with the reader. It doesn't remain with you. So you can include all the relevant information in there, but what you're doing is you're saving yourself space, and you're saving yourself word count. But when you put something in the appendix, it's up to the marker whether they go there and look at it. But, our markers are good. They will go there and look at anything you put in the appendix. So we'll talk about some of these strategies before. You may look and say, gosh, I've got 4,000 words. What am I going to do? Okay, make some editorial decisions. Get it right. So if you're at risk of going over the limit, please make sure you use an appendices. Can I just ask someone to mute there? We've got some children coming through and some background noise. So if you mute, that would be great. Part B, we've got address the specifics of what Part A is. So it's asking you to do a diagnostic tool. Please, have a close look at who your audience is, what age learners they are, what design you're going to use. Is it real time or is it going to be digital? And can I just ask that person if they could just mute their microphone, please, if you're getting background noise through. And Part B is where we want you to remedy the misconception. So there are two pieces of text here that connect and relate to each other. Okay, so if you can please, just get one bit, set up the diagnostic in Part A, and Part B, look at a learning sequence of 1 to 2 lessons. Don't go too far as to how you're going to deal with that particular constraint or that particular misconception. Would anybody like to ask anything about that at this point? Okay, that's quite all right. We'll go on. So,
sorry, Colin, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you get marked down if you go over the 10% for the word limit, or?
Well, it then becomes up to the marker. Then has to basically, the policy is the marker puts a line on your page and can read further, but will not give you credit for any work above the word limit.
Okay, cool. Because normally when I start typing, I can't stop, so I just have to make sure.
Yeah, so be editorially aware, use an appendices, that's all we're saying. And, it goes back to this notion of unfair advantage. I mean, we know what education's like and schooling's like, unfortunately, trying to create a level playing field. Well, the same in universities, you have a word limit and you're all given the same conditions and circumstances, and the expectation is that you work within that word limit to deliver an educational product. And so,
Thank you.
No problems. And okay, let's go on and look at the next slide. So getting going this week, we're talking about representations, and we've got a range of ways of trying to understand the student's journey. And the 5 E's is the model that keeps popping through as we start to look at our science curriculum. It's face it, it's the basis of science by doing. It's the basis of the ACS. It's the basis of primary connections. And the same guy, Dennis Goodrum, who wrote the ACS, is also very, very prolific in promoting Bybee's 5 E's. It's not even Bybee's 5 E's. It goes back well beyond Bybee. And so it's an old piece of teaching technology that's becoming more and more in vogue. So the science by doing folk raised the notion of using cartoons and little question interactions to try and get students into a particular science inquiry mode. Now, if you have been on the science by doing investigations module, you'll be able to see that there's a range of ways to introduce science investigations, and that's really what we're talking about with assessment task number 1. Because even though it's called misconceptions, Part B is about how you're going to address that misconception. So how you're going to bring in some science by doing, get the kids doing stuff to try and challenge and reconstruct their science understandings. So let's look a little bit more at why that's the case. So we've got here something I talked about in term 1 in the biological sciences unit. We got the work here by Agiris, who talks about single loop, double loop learning. Now, here we've got our first model of learning, the real world model, and it's equivalent to us. We walk backwards into the learning room every time, because what we do is we take information and we relay it back through our schema, back through our memory, and based on that information, we make interpretations. So our stimulus is very much the environment. Based on that stimuli, we are interpreting information, but it's all done retrospectively. It's done on the basis of what we've known and experienced. So obviously, we're going to have some misconceptions in there. That some of our experiences are going to be lacking in language, they're going to be lacking in maturity, they're going to be lacking in real-world application. So what's going to happen when we sit down to try and process some concepts is Agiris talks about the to do what we call single loop learning. Whereas once we've made a decision, where we've gone through and we're accessing or we're retrieving through our memory schema and we're about to make a decision, okay, we then go and we visit the mental model that we've established. And from that mental model, we then start to look at the decision-making rules we've applied and see whether they hold up to rational testing. So this is the information where the feedback loop gives us a working mental model that we're actually able to interact with, and therefore as teachers being able to disrupt, which is really important, because when we find a misconception over here, you finish up arguing with a kid. Okay, but here, if we're saying, okay, now let's set up a process where we can unpack that, where we can deconstruct that misconception, we can do some single loop learning, and we can get the student back into the learning cycle and revisiting their understandings. Agiris went on in the 1990s to talk about double loop learning. In the 2000s, he came up with triple loop learning. So his theories just get bigger and better. But in here, he talks about how we can change a mental model on which a decision depends. So this gives the teacher permission. This gives us an avenue to come into the world. So here we've got the real world, the information feedback, and the mental model it creates. Then we get the decision-making rules. It goes back into the decision. We test it against the real world, and we come up with a new and revised mental model. This is what we call science by doing. This is the investigative process. So where we identify a misconception, this double loop learning model gives us the tools to interact with the students through diagnosis. We work out what the student's mental model is first at stage 1. And stage 2, we attempt to shift that to a new understanding. And that's what we call double loop learning. And that's what you're demonstrating in assessment task number 1. That is the rationale behind it. A couple of things we can say about single loop and double loop learning. Chris Agiris is, obviously a brilliant theorist. He went on to write about triple loop learning, which involves digital and collaborative domains as well. But look, he just goes on to say that mental models affect the way we work. And all information and stimuli we receive affect our final decision about what we do, what we believe. And ultimately, the decision itself can change, but our mental model can remain the same. Okay, for instance, we often know this in terms of religious and cultural beliefs. So it's the predominant method of learning because it's very convenient. And once established a mental model, the next decision becomes very fast. So what we do is we finish up building, as the terms of neuroplasticity point out in brain science, we build neural transmissions, neural networks around these decisions, even though they're not necessarily proven, investigated, or supported decisions. Double loop learning. Here's where assessment task number 1 comes in. It's coherence theory, basically. And we've got this diagram down here. Mental representations come from what we call pre-propositional or prepositional representation. So it's everyday language. The sun rises, the moon sets. Mental models are the images we attach to the sun rising, attached to rain falling, all of these little things that we do that become embedded in our language. Now, Ludwig Wittgenstein talked about this in the 1920s. We've all studied this in our early unit on literacy and multiliteracies. Wittgenstein established the principle that language creates relational images. Those relational images create networks and clusters. Those clusters become neurally enhanced and they become memory. And from that memory, of course, we create mental imagery. And so this is the whole concept of how mental representations work. What we're doing with assessment task number 1 is essentially identifying a student representation, interrupting it or deconstructing it, and then helping reconstruct it along the lines of new science understandings. I won't say too much more about that. I think you understand the principles behind it. And anyone who's looking to include this in their discussion, Agiris, double loop learning, there's a whole heap of references out there for you to consult and will add considerable weight to your discussion in this assessment task. Learning outcomes, again, describe the ways which children use language, and that's what we're focusing on because language is a window to the soul. Let's face it, language constructs reality. It does, and we can measure reality, and we know reality varies incredibly amongst everyone, especially children. There's no such thing as reality because they're at all different points. Their informed belief of reality will vary incredibly depending on their knowledge, their history, their culture, their input. So we've got to describe a variety of approaches that can be used to answer questions using scientific investigations and plan and conduct a scientific investigation to answer a question related to chemical or physical sciences. So that's the goal by the end of this week. So the things we're looking at are mental models, scientific literacies, and investigations. Okay, so they're all the key concepts, the areas we're tossing around here. So in the scientific method, let's face it, I'll introduce you to someone in week 9. I think you really enjoy her work. Some of you will follow up on her work and obviously adopt it as a model going forward. But she talks about the fact that, in the old days, early childhood years and preschool years were considered far too young to be able to comprehend the notion of scientific inquiry or even the scientific method of coming up with a hypothesis and testing it and challenging it. Tim and Moby. I won't play it for you here, but if you Google Tim and Moby, any of people in the early childhood years, you'll see 2 wonderful little one-dimensional characters. They're cartoon characters, but they do some amazing science investigations. And they show once and for all that, science, this whole notion of the scientific method is openly accessible to children of all ages. And look, we know it too. We practice it all the time. Think about the last time you misplaced your mobile phone. What strategies did you do? I mean, the first thing you did was you stopped. Okay, you did your analysis. You then started to hypothesize about what you could have done. You then ran through all the alternate situations. You then started to mentally log the things that happened. It's natural to us all, this process of investigation. So, the mysteries of life with Tim and Moby, Google them. There's a whole range of online clips, and you may want to use one of these in perhaps assessment task 2 later as we introduce them. But either way, they're really good little resources for you to have as a teacher up your sleeve. Scoodle this week in the tasks was all about steps in the scientific method. So here's a little example of the POE, the same one that we could apply to Moby's little experiment there. So you make an observation, and scientists are naturally curious about the world. That's what we're talking about here. And based upon that, we form a question. And instead of forming a mental image, we do have a mental image, but then we get the skill of a good teacher is to get the student to interrogate that mental image, to form a question. After making an interesting observation, a scientific mind itches to find out more about it. Form a hypothesis. Conduct an experiment and analyse the data and draw a conclusion. Essentially, those 5 things are really what Scoodle is telling you. And obviously, at the conduct an experiment stage, analyse the data. You need to log data, so there's a missing step there. So it's very general. But if you can understand that those 5 steps are involved in the scientific method, and that the scientific method, we know there are at least, Loxley identifies 6 potential science investigation practices or inquiry practices, and the FAIR test is only one of them. Classification is another. Getting students to organise things, that's a wonderful little diagnostic tool. Giving students a table, setting down a series of objects, and getting them to divide into living versus non-living things, or getting them to divide into whatever concepts you want to be testing. A little example here, a POE from a primary school student. I did have the video, but I thought, no, I won't put up enough videos. Don't want to distract you from the key. But he had a project in junior high school, the younger years, and he thought that younger kids would have a smaller carbon footprint than older kids in his primary school when travelling to and from school. He noticed that about 3 times as many students were arriving by car than by bus. And then he also noticed that the number of kids were actually younger. So when he actually did set up his experiment and his investigation, he found that the school produces 505 tonnes of carbon per year, and 3 times more people went to school by car than bus. And also, as age goes up, carbon emissions actually go down. So as kids get older, they get more independent, and they're not getting dropped off to school by mum and dad. So we can see here, here is a really simple little science investigation based on a misconception that, that younger kids are smaller, therefore they use less carbon. And that misconception was beautifully corrected by the student when he undertook his own POE. So it's a wonderful little example of where assessment task number 1 is pushing us, into those sorts of areas. And this is why week 2, we're looking at FAIR tests. It's only one of 6 possible inquiry processes, so don't get hooked on it. But the Scoodle material does cover the FAIR test stuff, and I've also put a video up there on the discussion board too this week, which actually looks at the link between assessment task number 1 and the FAIR test. And it just basically says that a FAIR test is a good way to correct a science misconception. That's all I'm really trying to say here. And so the How to Teach Science, the video I've put up in the discussion board, really just covers this young person here who's going through the concept of a FAIR test. goes through the observation phase, goes through the recording, measuring, logging results, and of course brings up some of these great concepts that we know from Popper and from all the great scientists. Now, it's got to be reliable. I need to do the test again and again and again to make sure it's done. It's got to be generalizable. It's got to be able to go from examination to examination, and then it's got to be able to be disseminated. I've got to be able to communicate my results. And so this is the method that we talk about. This is one way of correcting. And you can see the steps of correction in there. The concept of a fair test. All the variables must be treated the same and must be treated fairly. The observation stage, okay? Watching what happens, actually watching what happens. Recording, measuring and lodging the results from what happens. And then repeating that process time and time again to test out the viability. And therefore, first time you test it, you may win students over. Second time you test it, you're definitely starting to change some thinking. Third time you test it, you're now starting to reconstruct learner understandings. So it's the scientific method. One way, but only one of 6 ways documented by Loxley, one inquiry method to help you address a misconception. And that's really what assessment task number 1 is about. How would you do that? So if you identify a misconception in part A, in part B, what are you going to do to address it, to teach it? So let's pause here now. Has anyone got a question they'd like to raise, a burning question at this point in time?
On that example video that you sent through that we just looked at on the other page, is it linked to a misconception, or is that just a example of the fair test? That's just an example of the fair test. Yes, yeah. I mean, if I put up an example there of a misconception, everyone's going to think that's the one you've got to do. So again, this is just an example of how a fair test can actually address a learner misconception. That's okay. I was just trying to rack my brain thinking, what on earth was the misconception that this lady was trying to prove? Again, you'd have to put it to a group of learners and say, look, I've got 3 different types of vinegar. I'm going to mix it with bicarb. Which one do you think is going to have the strongest or the most exciting reaction, and why? And work out what their reasons were for the reaction. And then, of course, go through and conduct the experiment, and then get into the discussion and try and set up the analytics, try and look at bringing the science and the science language into the discussion of why the result, and I imagine it had something to do with the sugar content of red wine vinegar causing the reaction that it did. Yeah. So again, deliberately left out any sort of relation to a misconception, more concentrating on the fair test. Now, you could use flip cards. You could use a table with different objects and get them to sort them into different classifications, animal or plant, or living or dead, or a whole range of things that you could do, insect versus animal, a whole range of things that you could get your students to sort. They could be cards. They don't have to be real objects. And I'll talk, for instance, relaying on this particular slide here. Part A really says select a science concept. And we open it up to all 4 strands. And misconceptions can be found in any strand. First thing you've got to do is identify your learner context. So you may have a mixed age group because that's all you can get. Fantastic. Just explain that you've got a mixed age group. Brilliant, no problems. So therefore, you're not looking for age-specific differences. You're looking for conceptual differences at stages of development. So you may be able to point out in your analysis that kids at the low end of your group, had these misconceptions. Kids at the upper end had this misconception. For the purposes of Part B, I'm going to target this misconception held by younger learners, and this is the lesson sequence I would use to address it. So you're very much in control. It depends on your audience. It depends on your science strand, and it also depends on the misconception that you identify as to which one you pick up and explore in Part B. So design a diagnostic tool that uses questioning to critically analyse the understanding that these learners have about your concept. So it can be a survey. I mean, we all lean to surveys because it's structured and it takes the thinking out of our head and puts it there. It can be flashcards. You can hold up a flashcard and say, okay, is this a creature? Is it living? Is it dead? Why? Okay, and just record students' feedback. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay, brilliant. Okay, when I ask this question, student number 1, thumb up, student number 2, thumb down. When I ask them why, here are the reasons given. Sophist is a mobile phone application. So if your sample is remote, and you're doing kids digitally,
you can set up a little sophist application where you can get them to answer multiple choice questions based on something that you either put up or you share with them using that particular phone application. So, and the nice thing about Sophist is it will also run the data for you too. It'll do tables and graphs. So there's a range of ways of conducting this diagnostic tool. So don't limit yourself to what's, immediately obvious to you. Think outside the box. Think about some ways that you can actually reach quite differentiated learners. They may be differentiated by ability, by age, by location, and just see that a good teacher can actually work to the core of most conceptions. Point number 3 is conduct your analysis. And your analysis should, in part A of your case study, should reveal the dominant misconceptions and learner understandings. So you may identify 3 or 4 misconceptions around one science understanding. Okay, you're only required to teach to one in your sequence, but your data may reveal 3 or 4. So report on each. And you may have, for instance, a frequency chart, a comparative table, a gap analysis. A gap analysis, a guy called Albrecht, 1995, looks at what's missing. Okay, so here we've got 3 students who said this, 1 student who said this, so we can assume that what's missing from this is, here we've got 3 of them represent the majority understanding, 1 represents the minority. We've got some differentiated concepts here. What is the gap that's differentiating? What's the problem? And sample 1 on the Moodle is a very good example of someone who's put together a really good data analysis process. There's no right way and wrong way to do this. You're simply reporting, on your own research here. You've looked at misconceptions, you've looked at a science understanding, you've looked at how well learners grasp that understanding, their reasons for doing that, you've charted it as data, and you've drawn some conclusions around what that data says. In part A, include examples and a comparison of the language used by different learners to explain this science concept. And again, that will come directly from your results. So you can't simply say there was a misconception and the misconception was this. You've got to show the marker how you got to that. Okay, what's being assessed here is your diagnostic capability and the energy you have for working towards a misconception. Once you've established the 2 or 3 misconceptions that may be sitting there amongst your learning group, pick one and then teach to it. Do your learning sequence. Any questions or comments around that? Okay. Another way to look at the assessment task too, where the ACS fits in. And this assessment task is essentially about science inquiry. Okay, that's really what it's about. The ACS has 3 distinct strands, so we try not to get caught up with those strands, okay, because the science understandings, it's the old science, teaching science as facts. What we really want to do is teach learners how to access the facts. And in this task, in this assessment task, we are modelling a learning sequence that's going to allow them to actually develop their understandings, their science understandings. So notice, for that reason, you can choose any science strand. No problems, because it doesn't matter what the understanding is. What's important here is how you employ science inquiry skills. So for assessment task number 1, think laterally. Each investigation for the purposes of this task is embedded in the content descriptors under the ACS. So science inquiry is normally taught along science as a human endeavour as well as science understandings. However, you'll note that the emphasis here in this assessment task is pretty much on inquiry skills, because we're looking at how students or learners use and influence, experience, use and live with the influence of science. How questioning and predicting can help us unpack their view and the consequences for holding that view or that particular understanding. How we can plan and conduct. Plan and conduct, 2 key science inquiry skills where we put together an investigation to enable the learners to reform, reconstruct their understandings. How we can process and analyse data. How we can evaluate that data, and ultimately, how we can communicate that data. So your learning sequence may involve paired learning or may involve people in groups of 3, and they're working through each of these 6 steps where they're questioning and predicting together. They're planning and conducting together, processing, analysing, they're coming up with collaborative design and collaborative outcomes, and of course they're evaluating together by talking, discussing and communicating their results ultimately. So we can see this assessment task is very much about science inquiry skills. So it doesn't really matter what concept or misconception you pick. Really, the bulk of the analysis here, the bulk of your teaching is going to be in the inquiry line or inquiry frameworks. Assessment task part B. And it's really important that we bring this out and dust it off right now too. Because what you've got to do is develop a learning sequence that works to correct the misconception identified during part A. Now, I had some interesting emails and forum questions from people saying, I'm thinking of doing this. I'm thinking of doing this as my misconception. Okay, my point would be put the horse back in front of the cart. Okay, why are you doing that? What did learners say about that? What is the misconception that justifies that? Because, you know, it's okay coming up with a great misconception, but you know, it's got to be based in what's going on for your learners. It's got to come from them. That's the whole principle of inquiry teaching, that the questions, the focus is all learner-driven. It all centres around the least capable other and is directed by the more capable other, either directly or indirectly through different methods of inquiry teaching. So when you look at part B, you know, we're really here talking about some key things that come off the assessment criteria. Correct one misconception. You don't need to correct them all. Believe me, it's going to take you 1,500 words to correct one, okay, and to justify what you've done. What pedagogy are you going to use in your learning sequence? Is it supported by current research? So if you're going to use fair test, are you going to use classification? What method are you going to use? What pedagogy? I mean, it's inquiry-based, but what style, what family of inquiry-based pedagogy are you going to employ? And how does it take account of the cognitive and language characteristics of learners in your chosen group? So why is that the right pedagogy for this particular misconception to teach, you know, to address this misconception as a learning sequence? What is the pedagogy and why is it appropriate? There are two things that you must cover here. The learning sequence should use ICTs where appropriate. Okay. Pause on that. You probably have something in mind and you're thinking to yourself, where can I use ICTs? All right. Think about, is there a simulation involved? Is there a simulation activity you can use the ICT for? Or can you use the ICT as part of the data logging? Are you going to be using phone or Google Docs? Or what are you going to use to do your data logging? Okay, and people are going to be videoing the results of their actual investigations. Are you going to get them to edit the videos and post them to a particular site where they can then present a report or a discussion? So all of these different applications of the learning sequence and how you can include ICTs, think broadly about those too. You also need to include a range of teaching strategies. So obviously, you know, think about what your learning sequence is going to be, okay, and think about the strategies that you're going to employ in that. And one of the other requirements from the criteria is how you're going to report your findings to students, parents, and carers. Again, you may not have too much thought about that at the moment, but one thing I would encourage you to think about is using a rubric. Now, sometimes teachers can, for instance, put graphs on walls and charts on walls. I'm a little bit concerned about some of those things because it's a little bit like a league table, and where there's a league table, there are winners and there are losers. And what we want to do is teach the love of science. We don't want to teach the love of competition. So think about how you're going to report your findings. You know, and again, a rubric is a nice way for reporting findings because it can be understood by a range of people, and it can be talked about by the learners, and it can also have clear outcomes on it as to what's required for a particular task. So these are all things that, you know, we really want you to look at when you're considering this assessment task. So essentially what I'm saying is there's a lot to it. It's not just a matter of picking out a misconception and sort of saying, here's my Band-Aid that I'd throw at that misconception. It's then about how do I include ICTs and why did I choose that pedagogy? Okay. Why is it relevant to my learners? What's the educational argument here? How am I going to report it? Okay. All of these interesting questions that we have when we come to education and it's you know, it's experience, how it plays out amongst stakeholders about learners and also parents and guardians. So it's important that we be aware of these kinds of issues and how we're going to deal with these things. The rubric: organise and presents results, and draws conclusions based on results and explains the science of the conclusions. So, again, it's one reason why I think a rubric is something to point to here, particularly when you're looking at a misconception. Okay, because you can actually go back very specifically and identify the misconception and the steps you take in your treatment of that misconception, your learning sequence, and what the learner does at each of those stages and how well they demonstrate they move through the beginning to the exemplary stages of performance for that particular understanding. I think that is my official presentation for this particular session. What I'll do now is throw open to people for questions, for feedback, and for anything that may arise from something I've said tonight. So here is the contributing student part of the session where you guys start to pull this apart now and start to make me work a little bit.
Hello, Colin. How are we?
Very well, Loretta. Yourself?
Yes, we're good. Thanks. We're good. Sorry, I missed last week. I wasn't available, so I'm doing a double catch up this week.
This does happen. That's quite all right. As long as you know what's going on and you know what you missed, that way you know what you catch up on.
Yeah, I've just got a few questions. I have to choose or choose a group of children.
Yes.
That I will present a misconception to, and then get and work on their feedback, and then present my assignment. Is that correct?
This is correct. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Now, what you're doing is you are identifying a group of learners, and often they're going to be a convenient sample. So don't think that that's a disadvantage. It really doesn't matter who they are. It's obviously a group that you can get your hands on. So it doesn't matter who they are. You then design for learning. You design for that group. So you create a diagnostic tool, and it can be a relaxed one. It can be an interview. It can be, flashcards. It can be thumbs up, thumbs down. There's a range of things it can be. It doesn't have to be a written pen and paper test, but you must have the capacity to capture the results and capture the language that students use around their conceptions as to how they're expressed and how they're formed. That way you can then analyse it. That's the analytical part of Part A, where you analyse the results and say, look, underneath all of this talk, I have identified and categorised understandings, and these understandings indicate a misconception here. And once you've done that, Part A is beautifully done.
Are you wanting evidence of the video?
Just what you can do is transcribe little bits that you think are relevant. The best way to present evidence in this particular assignment would be in a table or a frequency chart, where you're actually putting down the categories of understanding and, for instance, how many of your learners refer to those categories, or if you can break a science concept down, show how many hits there were and how many misses, those kinds of things. Putting in verbatim quotes from kids, as long as they're not too long, because bear in mind, if they're in the body of the paper, they're going to take up your word count.
I prefer to use appendices, and then I'll attach those at the end of my assessment.
Absolutely, and be editorially mature there, and anything you put in your appendix, make it count, and make sure the marker can go straight to it and see the value of it.
I think I'm been good. Thanks, Colin.
Very good questions, Loretta. Thank you. Any other questions people might have? It doesn't matter how silly you think it is. Have I gone over something too quickly tonight? Do you want me to go back and visit it and re-comment? Over to you.
So for section B, I'm doing my lesson plan, and then I'm writing a justification for that lesson plan about the pedagogy and how it's showing that the children will learn to correct the misconception.
Yes, absolutely. And the little description I've got on the screen at the moment, the pedagogy used in your learning sequence must be linked to current research on effective teaching and learning practice, and take account. So, for instance, you've got a range of articles there you can connect it to, and take account of the cognitive and language characteristics of the learners. Okay? So what you're doing, you've identified a misconception. So you've identified something cognitive they're not getting, but you've also identified the language they're using or misusing, which is helping to contribute to that misconception.
All right.
So your learning sequence is going to address those two things. Obviously, firstly, the language. And this is why, we looked at fair tests this week. You can step students through that learning sequence. What are we observing here? Okay, you call it that. Well, okay, actually its proper name is this, or its scientific name is this. And try and do it in a non-judgmental way. But the aim here is to reframe the learner understandings as you're doing. And this is one of the reasons why a fair test is often a good thing to do. But so is a classification exercise, where you can sit them down again, and your lesson may involve pulling out all your little items, putting them on the table, and then interviewing the students again and asking them why. Now, Johnny, you thought this was actually a living thing, whereas Ellie, you thought it was a dead thing. Tell us why. Okay, and get them discussing, and from there you can actually start to reframe some of the conceptions, and you can then set a little learning task which may consolidate those ideas.
Okay, I think I get it.
Right. If not, just shoot it through for an email and we can just keep unpacking things. But definitely, in part B, you obviously you've got to identify a pedagogy, why it's good for your learners. Okay, give us the current research, why it's the right pedagogy to address this misconception, and what cognitive and language gaps it's actually addressing. Okay, so that's basically what you've got to do. A very good question. Yeah. Any other great questions, please? And so you're thinking about this a lot. The questions are actually very, very detailed, very deep questions. So you're obviously at that level where, you're toying around with how you're going to tease this out and do it. So please keep the questions coming. Start using the forum and the email if you can. Any other concerns?
Colin, I've got one quick question.
Selena, fire away.
Now, when I'm doing my lesson plan, can I also record it and have a link to the recording?
Look, you absolutely can. Yeah, you can definitely do that. What I would suggest is chances are the marker is not going to go there. Okay, and the reason being is because you're actually reversing the analytical process there. You're handing it back to the marker to say, here is my interview, a recorded version of it. And so the marker is now expected to go there and actually interpret bits of that as evidence for your argument. So you're actually reversing what we call reversing the onus of proof. If you're a lawyer, that would be a brilliant move. But you're not a lawyer, you're an education student and a teacher. So what you've got to do is actually provide that information. You can't just link to it. So you've actually got to summarize it. And this is why I'm talking about a table, a comparative table or a frequency chart, or even some simple graphs to show what the key metrics around this misunderstanding were, or this misconception were. You can't leave that work to the marker to do. You must make it explicit. Does that make sense, Selena?
Yeah, I was going to. Yeah, it does. I was going to have like a table as well, but the lesson itself, I was going to write it up and everything, but also have it videoed as well so you can see it actually occurring with the kids.
Look, that would be brilliant, but I wonder if you're making a lot of work for yourself, because the marker primarily is going to rely on your analysis and not on the video itself.
Okay, not a problem.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
It'd be lovely though. I mean, I love watching those things, but unfortunately, it's probably not going to be to your benefit to do that. Any other questions or comments? All very, very good questions. I mean, ultimately, I'm hoping, Selena, one day we'll get to the point where we're actually asking students to video these rather than writing them up. Because sometimes I think written work doesn't do them justice.
Hi, Colin. It's Kelly.
Kelly, fire away.
Colin, I'm just a little bit confused just from the conversation with Selena then. We have to implement the questioning with students, then do, based on our findings, do a diagnostic and then write a plan for them, a teaching sequence. Do we have to then implement the teaching sequence, or it's just justifying the teaching sequence? It's
absolutely just giving that teaching sequence expression. That's all it is. It's turning your thoughts into action, Kelly. That's what it is.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not going to send you back to deliver the lesson. No,
that's okay. I'm just not on prac or anything at the moment, so I'm just going to use what I have.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, and I think it's imposing enough to ask you to come up with a group of learners, I think. But how else do you do
I'm
it?
Stealing children left, right and centre.
All right, be careful doing
We're
that.
all family, so it's okay.
Lovely, and that's brilliant solution, because what we're looking at is their concepts. We're not actually looking at their bodies. We're not looking at who they are and what age they are. We're really just looking at their concepts, and then how we identify, we consolidate, we define those concepts, we identify aspects of misconception, and then we teach it back into science conception. That's what we're trying to do.
Fantastic.
So, work. Yeah.
Thanks, Colin. And also, thank you. I really appreciate the bringing the class forward an hour too. It's so very helpful. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome, Kelly. And look, for everyone who says it's helpful, I get someone saying it's not. So that hopefully the recordings will get up nice and quickly, and no one will be too disadvantaged. Any other questions or comments? I mean, I'm really impressed by the level of questions. This is brilliant. My only advice is to keep... Fire away. Sorry, there's someone there?
Colin,
Loretta.
I'm gathering that this is on a Word document, so I'm asking the simple question, but I'm presuming it's a Word document.
Indeed, yes. I did have that query via email from someone, but not via the forum, so I had to respond just one-to-one, because I don't have permission to publish people's emails, clearly. But definitely it's a Word document.
Okay, yeah, because last term it was intensely web-based, so I just want to clarify that it's all a Word document. Okay, thank you.
It is indeed, yes. And look, after assessment task number 1, after week 5, we move very much to focus on assessment for the remaining 6 weeks. So in teaching this course, it's tricky. There's an awful lot of content, but what we're trying to focus on is the process. So step number 1, obviously, is the diagnosing, is working with student understandings. Once you've got that down pat, it doesn't matter what science it is, what strand it is. Once you've got that capacity to get inside learners' heads, that beautiful Vygotsky stuff, that constructivist work, once you've got that down pat, you can then do the same at the diagnostic stage, at the formative stage, and at the summative stage. So you've got that set of skills, and you can apply and reapply and rework it so that you can get the most out of all of your learners in a science classroom. If there are no other questions.
Colin, sorry. I have a silly question for you.
No such thing, Amanda.
Well, we'll see. Down the bottom it says, outline how you would report your findings to students and to parents and carers. Does that mean that the students aren't actually doing the lesson themselves, that it has to be explicit teaching?
Look, I guess report your findings to students and parents and carers. Okay, so assessment, this is splitting on the implicit split here is between assessment and reporting. So assessment is something that the teacher does, and they do it as learning. They do it, we assess learning too summatively, we assess it formatively as we're progressing through. So there's 3 different steps that the teacher takes in relation to assessment. But reporting is slightly different. So how are you going to feed this back in a common language to students, parents and carers? And so you may have a range of ways, and some people in this assignment even neglect this criteria, but it gets pointed out to them they neglect it by the marker. It's really important to have an idea of how you're going to report this back. So you know what you've done, but no one else, and parents aren't going to get just the amount of work that's gone into teaching one concept, into rectifying one misconception, but there is. And if something like a rubric shows the following steps that they've had to go through, here I've done an inquiry task, here have been all of the steps, here is how the student has performed on each of the steps, and as a result their level of understanding is roughly up at this end of the rubric. And the students will get that, the parents will get it, and carers will get it as well. And it gives you one common language in the form of a rubric for talking to 2 quite different groups, your learner and your learner's dear ones. So it's really important that when you think about doing all this wonderful teaching, that you then find a way to report the results in a meaningful way to those people who are interested in those results, who have an investment in those results. And it's really just pointing to the difference between assessment and reporting. Doing the assessing and the task is one thing, but then you've got to have a voice, a language, a mechanism that builds onto your learning and assessment process that articulates to the learner and to parents. Does that answer your question, Amanda?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
Can I just follow on from that, please, Colin?
Please, Loretta.
I know it states in part B for this reporting on your findings, but obviously that report would include information from part A. Is that correct? Or not?
Okay, again, think about it. We're not reporting the results of our analysis to students and parents. They don't want to know that. All they want to know is about their level of science understanding. In other words, how does this look in terms of my levels of achievement? So we know the Australian curriculum's got 5 levels of achievement. So really your rubric's going to have 5 levels of achievement, whatever you want to call them. So when you're reporting to students and parents, you can sort of say, look, here is this unit, here is this science understanding, and you're about here on the rubric. And in terms of procedure, and you're about here, 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 and you can identify where the student's at on each point of the rubric. So so you don't want to be reporting to parents. You don't want to convolute things by reporting, about misconceptions, about language issues and errors. All you want to do is say to them, look, at the end of the unit, here's where we're at. So how would you report your findings as summative? How are you going to report this? And so it's really got to be about where the learner's understanding is at that particular stage. So you've got to have a tool that describes it and visually represents it, and is simple enough so that everyone involved can understand it. Because not all learners are going to swing to your way of thinking. Some are going to hang on to their long-held misconceptions, and no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to shift them. But you still need to be able to report on why little Johnny's getting a C or a D instead of an A or a B for achievement.
Are you wanting evidence of that rubric?
Look, all you need to do is, yes. I mean, I think the best thing to do is to say, you could do a rubric, you could build a rubric or design a rubric. Throw together something. I mean, and that's why I've made this one available, and I'll put it on the Moodle, and so you can actually take it away and just work it. And you don't have to come up with a world-class rubric. All you have to do is say, how I would report this. I would adopt a rubric. Here is the general principle I would employ, where I'm reporting on each of the students' moves through the inquiry process, so that I can actually report back on how well their understanding has developed through that inquiry process as a result of my pedagogy. So my pedagogy is embedded in this rubric. My rubric put the students through a series of steps and stages, and here's what's resulted. The student's performing well in 3 areas of the rubric. In 2 areas, they're developing. So, we're going to have to come back in my next unit and perhaps do a little bit more work on this area. That's the sort of thing we're looking at.
So we could even do like a dummy report card.
Probably going too far, because it's actually saying to you how would you report, and you could do a dummy report card, yes, but it's more the science behind how you got to that report, and the thing missing between a report card and a teacher's desk is the thinking, and the thinking is what parents want to know. They want to know, okay, is he just bad at science or what? And you can actually say, well, actually he's very good at science, but here's where he's going wrong. Okay, in his application process. So that's the sort of thinking that you want to be able to report.
Yeah, just because for our assessment and reporting subject last term, we had to do like a mini example of explaining what they had to do for the assessment task, and then what their learning was about through it, and then it had like a grade from the rubric associated with it. So maybe something along the same lines.
Absolutely, and bear in mind, we're looking here at a situation that's diagnostic. So you've got one rubric that you're going to use for for formative and summative assessment too. So you've got your little diagnostic one here, and you're going to be able to point to the rubric and sort of say, at the end of this exercise, or at the end of this little teaching intervention, the learner's about here on their level of understanding.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you're going to your formative stuff, and in your next subsequent lessons, you may revisit that concept and put an extra lesson in if you find out more and more students aren't getting that particular concept. So, it gives you this, as the teacher, it's your permission, it's your insight into what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments at this stage? All right, I'm sure I've created a few. Please send them through, okay? You've got my guarantee that I'll get back to you within 2 working days with an answer. So please, if this does raise some questions, don't call Lifeline. call me, please send through an email, or get on the forum and start chatting to people, and we'll work towards creating in-depth understanding so that we can all go ahead with some confidence and enjoy assessment instead of wondering whether we're doing the right or wrong thing.
Tegan's got a question in the chat. Just she's asking if you can do it online through a student, teacher, parent website.
The reporting?
I'm assuming.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes. Again, the question is the teacher's thinking there? Is it evidence based? And I'll just see whether I can see you in the chat there. And would we best put it as an appendix? Yes, definitely put the rubric as an appendix. And can you do it through student, teacher, parent reporting site? Definitely, you can put a rubric up on the reporting site. But bear in mind, rubrics do tend to lend themselves towards a conversation. But bear in mind, you can put up a rubric. Definitely, it works better for summative assessment. When you're putting up a rubric, for instance, students may have done a detailed analytical task or done a science report, summative assessment, and you can put up your rubric. Works really well for that. When you're doing diagnostic stuff, okay, it's really a lot more about the understanding. So you as a teacher would create a rubric which is going to impact on learner understanding. It's going to describe the levels of learner understandings and the process you've gone through to get it. And at the end, you'll be able to ascertain just how well each of the learners have performed in that level of understanding. So you could put it on a student, teacher, parent website, but if it's just for diagnostic purposes, chances are no. Okay, chances are I wouldn't do that, because really that would be for summative at the end of unit stuff. At this particular stage, a rubric is your way of understanding where the learner's at. So you could sit down and talk to them or their parents, or a parent-teacher night, or it's that kind of reporting mechanism at this particular stage. So when you talk, this question says outline how you would report your findings to students and parents. Take control of that. Take control of that situation. The reporting of a student's conceptual understanding would be done on using a rubric, and at an interview with the student, with the learner, and also in consultation with their parents at a parent-teacher night. So the context is everything. Report does not mean summative all the time. Okay, you're reporting the findings of learner understandings, formatively to learners as you go through a unit of study. So that's really what this is asking you. Okay, so define what you mean by report. And if you're saying, well, this is an end of unit thing, great, then think about how you're going to produce a report. But for my intentions in putting this together, you're talking about how you're going to report on students' level 1. So what evidence do you have of where the student's performing? So you can then use that evidence to talk to parents and talk to the learner themselves. Is that any clearer? I mean, when we think of reporting, we often jump straight to school reports. We often think of jumping to one school. A lot of reporting of findings in a formative teaching framework, it is actually done teacher to learner and teacher conferencing with learner and parents. And so it's all about that developmental stuff as well. So we talk about reporting findings. Make sure when you're dealing with that you define what findings, what report means to you, and what findings you intend to draw from this exercise. Because if it's just diagnostic, there's really not too much summative stuff that you could report via a school reporting process. So just think about the logic of what you're trying to do here. Now I'm sure I've created some questions. Are there any other questions we can deal with tonight?
Hi, Colin. It's Kelly again.
Kelly, fire away.
This most probably sounds a silly question, but just when you're developing that interview process with the students at the beginning for Part A, can you just use a conversation you've had, or are you directing them to the area within those? So sorry, I don't know which area I'm choosing in the sciences. So
Right.
I've had several conversations with these children, and I thought, do I take a conversation and put it up into an area, or do I take an area and bring that down to where the children are, sort of thing? Does that make sense? Doesn't it?
Okay, let me try and ascertain what you're trying to ask here. So what you're saying is, do you come up with the misconception or do they?
Yeah, so we were talking, I was with a group of children. We were in a strawberry farm on the holidays, and we were talking about why some strawberries turn yucky and get all squished and that sort of thing. And so we were talking about earth sciences. And so do I then take something like that, the conversation we've had, and say, okay, we'll talk about earth sciences, or do I then choose, say, space or something, and then develop a question?
Now, look, I think if a misconception comes out of conversation, I think that's fantastic.
Yep.
That's your rationale.
Okay.
But
Yep.
then you have to design a diagnosis, a diagnostic step.
Yep.
To work out those misunderstandings. So definitely, if that's your rationale, it comes out of a conversation with young learners. So it's a hot issue. Fantastic. Yep. Then design for that hot issue.
Yep.
Create a diagnostic implement or tool or process, and then record the findings of that. So
yep.
Find a way of recording it, and once you've recorded, analyze, structure, and identify what the misconceptions are.
Fantastic. Sorry for the confusion.
No, it's a very good question, actually. A very good question. So where do you start? You start with the learner every time, Kelly.
Okay. Thank you so much, Colin.
No problems. All right. If there are no further questions, what I'll do is I'll end the session at that stage and get this recorded. And please do keep them coming through, because I'm sure I've said tonight, particularly with the reporting, this is not about summative reporting. This is about reporting progress. It's about formative reporting to the learner and to their parents, so that you've got to have a means of doing that. And a rubric represents a really nice snapshot of where a learner is. It's evidence-based because it's based on the task that you've constructed. It's addressing the misconceptions that you're targeting. And it will also locate and place learner understandings and practices within one common document. And it doesn't have to be summative. It can be formative, and it can even be diagnostic. So you can sit down at the end and look at your class's 20, 25, 27 outcomes on a rubric. You can average them, and you can come up with a level of understanding. And then for instance, where your starting point is when you begin to teach a particular science concept. On that note, what I'll do is stop recording there and get this up on the tube. And thank you all for your attending and for the fabulous questions. I think we generated some really good discussions, and hopefully we can build on that now through the forum and via email follow-up. Thank you and good night.